What is up, everyone, and welcome back to not a Skywatch update just yet, but instead a dev blog cover called Faking Windflow in Interior Spaces. Now, this developer blog post was written by the team's principal technical artist, Andy Green, and was originally shared on his personal blog, which goes over and explain many of the different kinds of challenges that Andy and the team are having to overcome to simulate the wind flow in Lost Skies. And in the coming game, the wind is a highly important game mechanic, which affects a large selection of ambient visuals and is the driving force behind sail-powered ships. And as the game will be set among the skies themselves, there is a ton of mapping and physical considerations that have to be done. One of the examples the devs give here is if a player is standing on the edge of a ship, the wind will be blowing diagonally across their flight path. And if the wind is flowing parallel to the wind, you'd expect to see the sail as slack and flapping sporadically instead of full from the direct pressure of the winds themselves. Now, in this same light, imagine you're in a giant cavern, one of potentially hundreds of player-made islands in a potentially randomly generated world. Now there's a tunnel to the cavern large enough to fit a ship, and let's say you decide to be a silly Billy and build your ship right there, sails and all. Now, while the island itself has wind direction, as they show us with the given global wind vector fields clip, there are plenty of cave flora and fauna, vines, and other objects that may be also there as well, maybe even a campfire that you've placed down. Now, how should the wind react here in this scenario? Naturally, you'd assume there wouldn't be much of any wind. If it happened to be blowing in the cave's mouth at the time, you would expect sudden wind shafts. Effectively, this generates a problem. Given this context, how do you create a non-cost intensive way to generate accurate winds such that it makes sense, looks correct, and isn't going to make anyone who owns a PC have a nuclear bomb going off in their rig? And since all these islands have been made in almost any number of possible combinations, how can we make the game identify these different points of interactable space within a global wind set that is turbulent in nature? Now, thankfully, we have different effects driven by CPU and GPU systems to account for these details. So, whatever method is used, it has to be usable by either system. The other nice thing is that these winds don't have to always be overly precise. It's more important to approximate the noisy fluid which can't be directly measured or seen. The first solution that went out for consideration is the quote dynamic solution, which is a sort of manual method where they could manually set up rays into the wind directions for different large and small objects, or even change the scatter pattern for those wind points. This would naturally make sense and not be very costly in the performance area, especially in a pre-built world, but as the world will be built largely upon by the players themselves, this rises for concern. Also, say we set a number of ray casting points for an object, and what if the players place down multiple campfires in the game? What about 12 sails next to one another? Or when players are together, it wouldn't make sense for all of them to be generating their own sets of visual points, especially when that could greatly affect performance. And while this only scratches the surface of the potential issues, it's clear that some of the other solutions need to be considered, as it seems they would need to work on creating a data structure better suited for this kind of scenario. The next consideration for what could possibly be done is the baked solution, which would require a pre-given dataset identifying different points in space. But in our case, the team has already had a dataset like this that may serve the purpose of accurately generating the needed wind effects. One that we actually covered all the way back in Skywatch 4, which was the light probes. And if you remember all the way back then, we covered their issue of accurately baking lighting and how they solved their lighting issues by utilizing a worldwide array of light probes to identify points in space and reflect back the correct lighting in reference to the day and night cycle. Now, in Unity's case, the system is called Adaptive Probe Volume, or APV, in which they provide an image of the representation of spherical harmonics that grid the layout of the APV. Now, what was so helpful about this grid layout is that lighting was able to be sampled quickly and cheaply. And in this case, these nodes are being stored. They're first order harmonics, which gives an approximate light intensity and color value for ambient light, as well as along every axis. Now, this potential use starts to make more sense when you think about what the light probe actually represents, which is a raised path from any light source. This also happens to include the consideration of how light bounces. So utilizing this system, we can assume that at a point or direction in space, there should be wind if there is light. Now, in hearing this, you might have thought, what about something like a desk lamp, or in our previous case, some kind of glowing cave flora deep in a cave? Wouldn't that not work logically to make a source of wind? And you'd be right. So for this type of solution to work, it would have to be used only on values for the sky, and more specifically, sky-generated light, in which the dev notes the sky intentionally, not the sun, because they have made a day and night cycle in which all the lighting data operates with an incredibly bright ambient sky, and not from a sun at a particular time of day. Now, with this, we can assign a certain threshold as a baseline for the sky's lighting bounces and when it reaches a probe. Thus, the wind would be present when necessary. So finally, a solution, or so you thought. You see, there's always a but with these things. This becomes much trickier as it becomes nighttime, as the sky intensity drops way below that of most interior light sources, and while normally one would assume that all you would have to do is simply lower that baseline light threshold, it becomes a problem when now we have random glowing mushrooms which were much dimmer during the day in comparison, or some plant or rock, for example, that is the brightest thing for 100 miles. And while you can still maintain that new threshold as before, adjusting for the time of day, you'd be discarding intensity values over the maximum that you would expect from the sky, which has potential issues, in which specifically dim light sources inside might be read as windy in this system. But so far, with additional fudging, this seems to be more of an acceptable compromise as to the dynamic solution we mentioned previously. Now, they provide more details here on the fudging they are doing to make this method work well in the form of lots of coding, and since I'm not even going to try and tell you I understand it, I will always have the link posted in the description so you can check out the programming for yourself. Moving on here, as to the previous concerns before about how a player's system would handle these different lighting and wind formatting, they talk more about the Async GPU readback. They mentioned the APV from before, or brick data, is encoded into 3D textures and thus is easily available on your GPU with Unity's own sampling functions, but this is not directly available to the CPU, and while you can get references to textured objects, you can't sample the rendered textures themselves. So you would need a system to do this, and as the title I mentioned suggested, they would have to read those textures on the GPU and request that data back to the CPU, in which the downside of this is that reading off the data from the GPU can be very slow, more than 100 milliseconds slow. This is because the way that the rendering works for their system is by sending data one way in a quote, fire and forget fashion. And in order to retrieve this data for the CPU to interpret, you have to wait until that fire data hits a syncing point for the GPU to retrieve it. The overall benefits on the Async GPU readback is that you avoid any kind of CPU stall, but you sacrifice the latency of the data you need. Now, as to the GPU cost itself of handling this kind of readback, the writer of this blog, Andy Green, has yet to measure the performance toll, and if this does turn out to be too taxing, a potential solution might be to limit this feature for rendering to those with faster graphics cards or more powerful GPUs only. Now, he covers a lot more stupidly complex coding info, which if you like, you can check out on your own time. You are more than free. But to summarize, many considerations had to be made when being aware of this potential rendering lag time, like how the game identifies different lighting, wind, and sound reactions in reference to this potentially slower latency for those without higher end GPUs. But all in all, with the different programming methods he worked on in regards to the wind systems themselves, when data arrives back to the CPU, the async callback is called, and each request is iterated over, then sent back, in which now they have a way of supplying any asset in the game some approximation of how much contribution the global wind system should have over it on the differently made islands. But as to Andy's own opinion on the matter, this whole process, he was able to explore light probes and some core mathematical concepts which drive them, as well as some of Unity's adaptive probe volumes, and he learned a lot about how the async GPU readbacks and the required CPU systems fundamentally worked. Similarly, a high-definition rendering pipeline was implemented into the island creator and baking process from the father of the island creator, Tom Jackson, who gave great insight to how some of the exploits of Unity itself worked when developing the original island creator for Worlds Adrift. And to directly quote Andy here, "As I continue to experiment with light probes, adaptive probe volumes, and wind, the journey is as valuable as the destination. Each step not only adds a layer of realism to Lost Skies, but also helps me develop my skills as a developer and technical artist. It's these intricate details which audiences often take for granted, but add to the feel of a convincing and compelling world." And I think he makes a fantastic point here in this regard. All he has talked about in this devlog is the massive undertaking it has been to build these different lighting, wind, and rendering systems that help to put together the building blocks of the world of Lost Skies. And I think in many ways it has contributed to showing off the sheer amount of work that had to be put into something that we often take for granted in game development. Yes, you could find the cheapest and most efficient method for making simple wind effects, but when you want to build this fully interactive world with highly accurate wind physics, especially in a game where the skies and weather itself is such an integral part of the game, it's beneficial both to the experience of the game's designers and the overall experience of the player that these areas receive such a high level of attention, even if the average player may not think much of it. So I want to thank Andy Green and his team for sharing this devlog, as well as all the painful and countless hours of work they have been putting into this game's development, as well as you guys for staying until the end. And like always, have a beautiful rest of your day. Peace.